Well, thank you, and I'm really pleased to be here, and thanks, Jeff, for organizing, and Laura. It's great. It's great. It's amazing meeting. It was a don't miss event, and actually I got here. Peter said, "Oh, it's a turning point." Well, maybe that's that. If it's that, I'm glad not to have missed it. But it really is it's a very important event. First, an apology. Green legal theory, as we discussed over lunch, has been a long time in the making. And we talk about slow foods, and now people talk about slow scholarship. I've invented eternal scholarship. It's very slow, and it's coming out. But the thesis, in fact, this thesis logis law is something that really I only sort of finally figured out about 3 or 4 years ago, which is now allowing me, to finish this thing. So I'll get back to what logis law means in a minute. But let me give it a bit of background. In this meeting, the talk about environmental law to ecological law is an interesting change, and I've got a couple of comments on that which green legal theory fits into. First of all, people have talked about Kuhn. I think, Max, you mentioned Kuhn and your paradigm shift. When you read Kuhn, you realize that paradigm shifts don't happen just up here. Paradigm shifts happen through physical revolutions, basically. And one of the arguments is the advocates of the old paradigm have to die before they make room for the new paradigm. And I do think that, and it's true, generations who control the discourse, get pushed out of the way. So it's a big struggle. So I think this is a paradigm shift. So on the two, I call EL, the two letters, the E letter, I totally sympathize with this. Ecosystem integrity or ecological integrity is a key variable, and very important as an activist. That's always been any environmentalist goal. However, the second term, law, is to me where the action is. I agree with you about the goal, but I think for my argument, the way this has evolved with me is I've gone rethinking the nature of law that then leads me back to the goal for environmental goal. But that's not I'm not going to talk about that in this case, in this presentation time, for one. Law, the issues underlying green legal theory have been touched on in frustration all through here, but not addressed as such. And I think that's important. So, for example, I always tell in the preface of this book, I taught sort of an apocryphal story. It's been a real story, but of meeting someone in a what do you call it? A reception. I said, so what do you do? Oh, I teach environmental law. Oh, that must be good. That's useful kind of thing to do. And I say to myself, well, actually, it's not true. I don't really do it anymore. I don't believe in it anymore. I'm sort of like, it's kind of not where I'm at. They go, really? Why is that? I said, well, where do you have to go to get environmental law or ecological law implemented? The state. Who's the biggest developer around? The state. We got a problem. That's a problem. The state is a problem, period. Because the state encourages development and facilitates development and has pension plans to make sure that they do well. And even economic growth, the economic growth paradigm, which is attached to capitalism, growth, capital needs returns to capital. But as a social paradigm, really comes from the state. Not from corporations, because corporations went up and down and they'd crash, and somebody else would, as long as you had multiple corporations, someone would move over and take them over. But in the 30s, in the Depression, which still resonates hugely, as Jane Jacobs says, in today's consciousness, you can't have unemployment. The state has to pump up the system. It has to keep it going, it has to keep it growing. GDP, it's GDP. So the state is driving growth, much more even than corporations, because they've made it a systemic thing. As one writer, Timothy Mitchell, says, the economy as a concept was invented in the 30s, which I think is true. So we've got a problem that is fundamental to anything we want to do with a state, capitalist state, which is how we live. So in the Anthropocene, to me, there's a whole bunch of lessons from the Anthropocene. The term makes me nervous, and how it gets treated, it makes me kind of nervous. But I think there's a couple of key issues, and climate change is a good example. We live in a full world now. there's a narrow band of possibilities for human action, which was fine when we could just dump it on, primitive countries and rip off their resources and not worry about it, or oppress the underclass and laborers in the Middle Ages or in the Industrial Revolution. But now in a full world, we can't just externalize costs anymore, because they come back even to the center states of the world. So one of that narrow band means that, unlike before, where we could just behave immorally, the West and the rich countries, socially constitutive relations, what relations we create on this planet, are absolutely central to survival and to health and to ecological integrity. So unlike before, where we could externalize, we cannot externalize, and we can't create institutions that externalize. We have to create different ones. That's the first. As soon as you do that, realize that you're dealing with power. You're not dealing just with law, you're dealing with power. And you're dealing with constitutive power. How is power structured in ways that constitute who we are and what we can become? And law, that's margin to law. It frustrates us, but law is about reform. It's about taking the systems, the legal system, the political system, the state system, even capitalism as a given, and trying to make it better. I mentioned at the break, there's a great book by Halley and Wendy Brown, Janet Halley and Wendy Brown, called Left Legalism, Left Critique. And the argument of that book is left legalism undermines the ability of left critique. What's the solution? We need a solution. Let's use the law to get a solution. Whereas left critique says, well, no, let's understand the problem more and make that and go after the understanding of the problem rather than quickly going for a solution. And so to me, again, just as climate change indicates little space in the world, when you turn to power, you realize that there is, not only is there not much space left in the world, there's too much power in the world. The quantum of power in the 21st century exceeds anything that humanity has ever had to deal with. Think of the American military, or when you get a maniac like Donald Trump, who could, everyone's afraid, he could cause World War III. We cannot have power like that. That power is too great, is unmanageable, especially when you mix it in with being driven by growth. So well, that tells me we have to rethink and expand the conception of the law, because for a whole bunch of reasons, but because we are constituted by forces, power, for example, state power, economic growth, by forces that are not regulated legally, but in fact constitute who we are and what we can become in a new era of human history and global history that requires their regulation in ways that we've never done before. So if you look back at the history of environmental law, particularly say in the 70s and 80s, the critical legal studies movement, environmental law had really no role in critical legal studies because it was reformist. It was not radical enough for a lot of the CLS people who were more concerned about class, race, gender. Environmentalists were on a tear. They're getting all this legislation out of DC, and it was like the thing to do. Your first stage, right? The regulatory, not the deregulatory stage. So it wasn't actually part of critical legal studies. And critical legal studies, as a result, I think, missed the boat, as a lot of the left has, because if environmental natural nature were taken seriously, it'd be a very different discourse going on for the last 30 or 40 years, and even today amongst much of the left, which is just focused on, essentially, on class. So environmental law had missed the boat in the critical world of the legal world of the 70s and 80s, but could in fact turn that boat around very differently by reconceiving law. So there's a book called Critical Jurisprudence from a couple of guys in the University of London, University of London. And their thesis is critical jurisprudence. Jurisprudence was critical up until the late 19th century. Marx was critical. He was a jurist because he had a PhD, and he looked at the role of law as an instrument of oppression. Max Weber, lawyer, looked at law and bureaucracy and the role of organized state systems in disenchanting nature and so on. So great sociologists and philosophers, most of them historically were lawyers. So that got split, and law became a technical discipline, much more of a technical discipline in the late 19th century, and much less of a philosophical discipline. So, for example, if you ask what is the philosophy behind environmental law? What is the philosophical underpinnings of environmental law? Well, the closest, I think, it's liberalism. It's the liberal individual and the nature of democracy, but I don't think there's a really sophisticated environmental law theory that explains how it operates apart from a sort of reformist liberalism, and that's a big gap. So we need, I think, a greater social theory of environmental law behind environmental law. So that's what GLT aspires to be, which is why it's taken so long. So logics is law. What I mean by logics is it's got a long philosophical tradition. It goes back to Aristotle and Plato, in particular Aristotle, and the concept of logos, the word, telos, something having, and this is a big philosophical debate, of course, something having an inherent purpose, and people can be essentialist about it. Aristotle talked about an oak tree, an acorn wants to become an oak tree. Its telos is to flourish as an oak tree. But so there's issues about that. But what are the logics of capital? Growth is a logic of capital. What's the logic of the sovereign state? Well, there's tons of books on that. Agamben and the total control from the top. The sovereignty, exclusive territorial control, so on. So there are logics driving capital. There are logics driving the state. There are logics driving everything. There's the word logic. You'll start now. You've seen me use it or heard it here. You'll see it everywhere. The logics of capital. What's the logic of the automobile? Right. So if you think of the logic of the automobile in the 1890s, it was just a little new invention. Well, it needs gas. It needs infrastructure, and eventually that logic, and this is my argument as to how the linearity of law, as logic is law, the logic of the automobile led to, for example, freeways, big cities, suburbs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and lots of oil and gas, lots of gas, lots of energy companies and car manufacturers, huge, what I call animations. So you've got this logic, which is not law in a legal sense, but it's a social logic. And who was thinking about that social logic? And we've got zillions of laws around energy exploration, exploitation, urban planning, cars, but we never had in the past an assessment of logics, the logics of the automobile. Do we want those? How do we think about those? Right? So the idea of expanding the concept of law to include logics and have a kind of dialectical relationship between legal laws and social logics. I have a definition to me of law. That's an expanded definition. And that is authoritative processes of social self-constitution. Authoritative processes of social self-constitution. Now, self, I put in brackets. Authoritative means power. It doesn't mean just legitimate from the parliament or an Austinian definition. It's just who has the power to enforce, to create their authority. Secondly, processes. And you can look at the processes of logics, the way they develop. A logic then becomes kind of a dynamic. So cars become a dynamic in the 1910s, 1920s. People want them, and Henry Ford comes along, and how do you get them sold? So you get the sort of Fordist arrangements, and now you need infrastructure, you need states to support it. So it becomes a dynamic. That dynamic eventually becomes a system dynamic. We can't let the car industry go down because there's all that employment attached to it. And so we develop these systems, what I call animations, things with their own momentum. So the idea of law is we have intention. But an animation, people can say it's determinist. It's not determinist. An animation has intention, its own intention. The car industry, no one controls the car industry. The car industry needs to keep going because it generates employment and so on. So rather than saying, let's get rid of all these cars, cars are the stupidest thing on the planet, and they can be used a lot less. Instead of doing that, we have to adapt everything. We have to have renewable energy. We've got to have electric cars. Why do we need electric cars? All this energy. We can't talk about that. The animation of the car that developed through its logics over 100 years are such that we're powerless, right? So if you expand the concept of law to look at logics, all of a sudden power comes back, because you say, well, wait a second. We should have a right to talk about how those things develop, because they're constituting who we are. Just as much as any government is constituting who we are, these animations are. Okay, I'm almost done. They're constituent. So that's kind of the basic thesis of green legal theory. And how it changes things is amazing. So for example, automobility, there's a great book on automobility. The seventh generation rule from the Iroquois Confederacy. I don't know how legitimate that is a historical construction, but that idea that we look 7 generations ahead, we don't look any generations ahead. We just, what will keep GDP going up tomorrow and next week and next year? That's about as far as it goes, and keep pension funds going. So what if we started thinking long term and actually had a concept of legitimate right? Is the state, as it works today, a legitimate institution? Is it actually, what's the basis for its legitimacy? Some historical construction 400 years ago where they just made up this idea of the social contract? Immanuel Kant said, anyone who questions the legitimacy of the states, it should be a capital offense. Well, there you are. I'm on video now too. Where does legitimacy come from? Legitimacy comes from authoritative of truly self-constitute collectively who we are. Where does authority lie? What do we do? Do we have new laws? Legislators? Well, look at the structure of democratic power, right? Party systems, and it's mostly lawyers in the halls of power, versus what I would call animators, who are really, in fact, constituting what we can become. So you've got animators like Steve Jobs. You've got animators like indigenous people saying, stay off our bloody land. This is our land. We shouldn't go in there. You've got all new social movements. Those guys are all dealing with logics. And so it opens up the conception of not fixing an environmental problem, but reconstituting the culture and the institutions that cause those problems. So it doesn't defer to power or put it aside. It says power needs to be regrounded. You talk about a Grundnorm. We need to ground power in ways that allow us to flourish, allow ecological integrity, allow logics, creating animations and logics that make us different people. We will reconstitute who we are. We look back at the 19th century and say Victorian mores are back, and all these people are crazy, they're crazy. Well, there's no crazier generation than our generation right now, which faces incredibly huge problems where the real issues of those problems are not even allowed to be talked about. So you can talk, and so a good example, I've heard this phrase, the economic growth paradigm, which as a phrase I really don't like, because it's not an economic growth paradigm, it's capitalism. But as soon as you talk about capitalism, sorry, there's the door, out you go. Your credibility's gone. So there's discourse, the logics of discourse, right? So we avoid all of that. And if we didn't avoid it and said, this is a legitimate basis for social decision-making, the only legitimate basis for social decision-making in the Anthropocene, then we have a very different definition. And it leads back to, okay, what do we want? What is the environmental element of this? And then that gets back to ecosystem integrity and ecological integrity and so on. So that's kind of, the people will talk about, it's not immediate, it's not realistic. I don't agree with that. I think it's the opposite. We lack agency. It's a huge boost to agency to say that we humans on this planet have a legitimate right that trumps any existing animation, whether it's capitalism or the automobile or the state, in the Anthropocene, to say we need to reground this, because that is where we're going. So if Trump goes his direction, where he's totally, the lesson of Trump doesn't care about law. He's always concerned about his animations. He just wants, and neoliberalism was a product of animations. People saying, how can we restructure the state? U.S. Chamber of Commerce. How do we restructure the state to make sure we can continue economic flows and decertify or disempower trade unions and so on. We need a generation of people creating, we have them, but new animations and new discourses around creating logics. So ends my category.
Okay, the 5-minute rule is now in effect for questions or comments.
Thank you. That's a great paper. I'm not sure if this is going to be a question or a comment. We'll see what comes out. I really have valued Wendy Brown's work as well, and that book, Left Legalism, Left Critique. I really enjoy it. I think her new book, Undoing the Demos, is really good on the kinds of stuff you're talking about as well. I wondered, I guess one question I would have is, there's a critique that Wendy Brown has made about the proliferation of rights talk into politics. And I think I like rights talk as a kind of strategic tool. I think sometimes it has a time and a place. But I wondered if the challenge that she makes to rights talk in that book resonates with you, or what your thoughts on that are?
Trying to think. You talking about Undoing the Demos?
Oh, I meant in Left Legalism.
Oh, Left Legalism, that's critique. Yeah, well, I mean, the thing with her criticism of rights talk is it pushes you into the legislation, into the judicial area, versus making a social movement, building a social movement that challenges the power relationships. I totally agree with that. I think rights talk, yes. I mean, it's not an easy answer. Say, I've been an active environmentalist forever, and no matter what, you end up going back to government and saying, protect this area, don't kill this frog, don't do whatever, right? Because that's all we've got. But that's not working, right? I mean, the environmental state of the planetary environment is getting worse and worse. The Anthropocene is a serious issue, and so I think the problem with the big problem for me with rights talk is it takes so many of the processes and structures and limited outcomes as given. You know, at best we're going to achieve it in this one place with this one judge who may incrementally do something, but the momentum is continuing the other direction. So it's not that one is necessarily, and this is a tough one, anti-legal strategies, but I think the legal strategies have to be contextualized within a much larger conception of power and law and the potential of citizens to shift the power away from colonizing institutions, including the law and the state.
One more question.
Oh, go ahead. No, I guess more comment. I'm quite happy that you support such a radical shift, because that's what I also say briefly when I talk about it. I think, having been working on environmental law for many years, I think that often we do the fine-tuning of the law, or fine-tuning through jurisprudence, or fine-tuning through administration, but that's what we do not need. It's not what we are aiming at. We need a radical shift, and probably you much better than I could do. You explained that
But I don't think it's a choice. I mean, the ecological integrity, the problem with me with ecological integrity as a Grundnorm is, and it's been discussed, is I think what we've done with the West is all these critiques of the West and liberal modernism and all that, that what the West has instilled into the planet is the individual. And, you know, post-human discussions now are saying, you know, the individual is a fraudulent construction. You know, Jennifer Nadelsky at U of T talks about relational autonomy, right? Well, if it's relational autonomy, then what have we got? Right? What is this? What is the actor? And I don't think it's the individual, and I don't think it's ecological integrity. To me, the one that's left is local, people in place, right? And that's been eviscerated. So to me, where law, this discussion of law leads back to, is the social ecology, is the social ecosystem, is people in place as the actor, the key actor, the power center that's been eviscerated. and that needs to be protected and revitalized. I mean, it's been, my older son was teaching at University of Florida State University for a couple of years, and we would go down to visit him, and it's just unbelievable. The South, the American South, it is such an eviscerated place where people don't have any power, right? Their communities, and this is where Trump certainly gets support, and the argument that these people want to see the liberals smushed because anything that makes the liberals upset is fine because they've got such crappy lives. Well, it's not that there's nothing. The food, there's no food culture, there's no economy, there's no depth to the place. I mean, unlike where you come from, and that's what needs to be revitalized.
Yes, it's understood.
All right, thank you again.